Okay. Well, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for your invitation to come here. This is the second time that I have participated in an organization, in an event of this kind, because obviously I'm not a specialist on the subject, but it's true that I have participated over recent years in activities related to this. I'm going to try to talk about the communicational context and the tools that I believe make it possible to create a favorable climate for these systems of capitalization around the world. I'm going to start to talk about communication in times of uncertainty, and public communication to a certain degree has become crisis communication, and crisis communication was something that was defined in certain circumstances, but nowadays it's become ordinary communication. And in some way, the characteristics of crisis communication, which are very specific and very special for a specific moment, now are extended to the everyday exercise of communication. And this is important in our communication strategies. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how we are seeing new interlocutors and new values. And this is important when we think about our communication and public activities, or when working with the society and when working with governments from our perspective. Thirdly, what should be the content of that communication, distinguishing between data, narratives, and management, which is entirely linked to the previous 2 points. And I don't like to talk about recipes, but clues perhaps about how to recover confidence in 3 pillars: social, political, and media. If we take that approach, then we have to understand that we live at a time when all communication is crisis communication. Why? Well, because basically we live in a world which is retransmitted in streaming. We lived for many years depending on newspapers, and then we had the news on the television at midday or in the evening. But now any event is broadcast on streaming, and we get information via streaming, and we see things which are dramatic, in my opinion, because if we could separate ourselves from them, we would, and stand back, we would actually find them entertaining. I mean, we have these coverage of natural disasters. And they say, no, there are 3 people that have died. No, the 5, we've been told it's 5. No, we've been told it's 2 victims, because there's no filter being applied. And this affects us in the coverage of any kind of event, whether it's a natural disaster or otherwise. So these immediate times have an impact on information, and they have an impact on information management as well as political management. And this is really important. Political management is much more reactive than it was in the past, and it's much more immediate than it was. We're talking about the logic of feelings, and there's no real perspective towards the future. Politics is infected by the immediacy of communication, and to a certain degree it's starting to take real-time decisions on the basis of feelings. Where we'll see later, there's a huge emotional element. It's intuitive, and rights are turned into feelings and not the other way around. And certain issues, well, I mean, victims are easier to locate or to indicate or to create even, and this is particularly visible and serious. And this happens in a context such as COVID, as we've heard about in previous sessions, which has led to huge social and media pressure. Threats already existed in the social and political context, and these have been strengthened and particularly visible because of the world crisis. There's been a correlation which is sometimes difficult to justify, but has been clearly seen, and there's no point denying it or trying to find any logic. The crisis caused by COVID has, in some cases, been given as a solution by way of the change in model or the change in the treatment of savings. We've seen it in US, Mexico, Peru, Chile, and sometimes prior to COVID even. But we can see that the connection of events that initially don't have anything to do with each other end up generating or creating a perfect storm, which, if we don't have a rational correlation, it could seem quite unexpected. And this makes us think about the need to face a challenge in a more, not serious way, but a more strategic way, adapting our communication formulas of a traditional nature, ordinary communication, we could say, to crisis communication techniques. And crisis communication, well, I could tell you that ultimately it has crisis management as a fundamental aspect. In this regard, the context is a context of a crisis in confidence, which affects everybody, and it can be explained as being due to the value system, government failings, the way society deals with its economic, social issues. And in this setting of uncertainty, people are looking for certainty, and initially, certainty can be obtained or is looked for in the state. It's only when the state fails to respond that people look for other formulae, which are much more diverse. However, the traditional structures, and here I include economic structures as well, they continue to think that power can be separated from trust. If we have a crisis in trust, which explains the uncertainty of society and their reactions nowadays, well, we still think that people who hold power, or those who hold power somehow, with having that power, that is enough. We have that series about superheroes from Marvel. I'm not a big fan, but this one really caught my eye. We have this phrase which describes the attitude of some elite groups in the contemporary world. They say, why do we need trust if we've got power? It's only when we lose power that we try to gain trust. So nowadays, according to the new rules of power, this is explained in recent books. When they talk about the end of power, they talk about the end of what is great. They're talking about changes in the rules of power, and these changes in rules of power have different characteristics that we can't see as yet today, but we're always talking about a common element, which is trust. So this is all about being able to fulfill oneself and the need to recover the trust of society. There are different players who were not normally necessary for the ordinary work of organizations, but they are beginning to be essential. For many countries, in my opinion, our organizations had a captive audience, let's say, because it was mandatory and the choice of society was decided by an intermediary company and not by a customer relationship. And in many countries, at least the ones where I've been able to work, or the ones I've been able to analyze, they have forgotten about the customer or the client, knowing that they were going to come anyway because it was legally mandatory and they had no choice. So if we put the customer at the center and if we serve the customer, then we focus more on effectiveness rather than communication. And from a regulatory point of view, we felt safe in a favorable regulatory context in which we only had one objective, which was for the state, the government and the parliament to keep the rules as they were, to not change it. So if we were controlling political power, we were controlling social power to a certain degree. We didn't need to work with the social base in terms of our employers, our customers, and the rest of the society and its perceptions, because the rules were only changeable by a few. But when that was broken down and we saw that society was able to modify established rules and rules that were functioning or regulatory contexts that were working in a reasonable way, the threat became greater. Now our target audience according to the regulatory framework, is no longer the state, the government, and the parliament, but rather the entire society. So this is a challenge that we were not used to in the past. Many people, many organizations were not used to that. We weren't used to being accountable to the user, to society, to customers. It was enough, let's say, just to be accountable to the executive power or the regulators. And by contrast with this social power, what happens is that there is no player that can get their objectives, achieve their objectives on their own. And this leads us to alliances, partnerships in which society, customers begin to have a relevant role. And public policies and networks have an important role. They can all have an impact. And where it's in this situation, we have to take it into account and change the way we view public powers. We need to work more strategically and in a broader way with an essential basis, which is highly consolidated in the view of the public. The goods, the assets of all of us are a shared responsibility. And so there is a change in values. And these values, in my opinion, are the ones that are going to set out the logics for communication. So we're talking about values such as what's justice or injustice. And as we saw in the earlier session, about whether we want to reduce inequality or eliminate poverty. And these frameworks determine our social position and the position of our organizations. We can talk about effectiveness or efficiency, so the effectiveness that we could understand in an organization that gives benefits, good results, technological improvements, easy access through an app, versus those which are integrated and offer, or within their organizational project, are looking to improve society. The need to do things well and to be exemplary in ethical terms. In some countries where I've worked, we have discovered that with that mentality of the captive audience, we saw that organizations were not really doing their job well. They were just complying with the rules, knowing that, or because they thought that by meeting the rules they were protected. And there was social ill feeling, and when there was a favorable wind, in regulatory terms, for example, well, everything suddenly came out into the open, and this discomfort, this unrest suddenly appeared. And some of that came from people who had direct relationship with the organization and had done for many years, and there had been no prior warning of this unrest or dissatisfaction. And we could also mention focusing on common good and the most vulnerable. We have seen that people react in a positive way to family, community, human development, dreams, compared to the negative conceptual framework that I'll mention later on. When we review the conceptual framework for the narrative behind social attacks, well, we could think, well, it's out of proportion, so far from reality that it's better to ignore them. But there is nothing, Ortega said that there's nothing worse than reality that prepares its own revenge, because people act on the basis of their perception and not reality. If people build a framework in which their view of organizations is based on these concepts, and that's what they normally talk about, I mean, we might hear them on the radio, for example, they end up building a framework where they may oppose private ownership, and this is toxic when it comes to building a favorable narrative where there's a distinction, for example, as we saw in Colombia with the electoral campaign between large and small companies to create a distinction in which one were the enemy of society and the people, whilst the others were their great allies. So from that perspective, it's important to know where we are in order to understand where we can go. And to summarize, the basic element for fully understanding what our narrative framework should be is to forget about efficiency. Because efficiency is a concept which in the business world you can understand it and it's praised, but in the social context it's no longer a value. Our organizations have to work well, but that's not enough for society. Society doesn't ask us to be more profitable. Society is not even asking us to guarantee their savings for the future. All this seems contradictory. What society is asking us to do is to integrate in a way in which we show solidarity with the current social context and that we should be able to give a response. And these are the responses that we have to work on in order not to fall into providing an easy response, which would be suicidal, in my view, such as the withdrawal of specific funds at a particular moment in time. So we need to forget about efficiency, understanding that it's inhumane and cold. We should move our narrative framework to something more, which is, in fact, something consolidated. We could talk about compassionate capitalism or caring ethics. And we are somehow giving narrative answers that don't necessarily have to change the way that we act, but rather our position for communication purposes. We're giving answers within the framework that society is looking for answers. And this would be the end with regards efficiency, as Aguilar Camín says. It's a Mexican who I think best understands the political reality in Latin America. It's not enough to get it right. Being right is less than half of things, or correctness is less than half of things, and being right is a quarter. And we think if we're efficient and effective, that should be enough for people to want to hug us. And they should even go out onto the streets and defend our system. And we don't realize that the framework for development is nothing to do with effective or having the best systems. It's a different framework, which is much different, much more emotional, with a narrative which is much more social and based on trust. Trust is necessary. If we want to build trust, we have services, communication, and projects. I'm not going to have time to talk about all 3 points, but I am going to talk about communication, which is what I know the most about. So the first thing we have to do, as I said before, is that we have to understand that people don't act in relation to their reality, but they react as on the basis of their perceptions. They take decisions on the basis of their perception. So we have to understand that our work is about perceptions and not reality. And then we need to have data, sufficient data to create a narrative. It's not enough to have communication based on denying evidence or denying data by means of evidence. It's a communication mechanism that at times of crisis you can use, and it has been used in some countries in a way which I feel is insufficient. But our proposal has to go much further than trying to explain that data supports what we're saying, that we are right. Rather, it's about building a suggestive construction so that we can show that our overall proposal within the system is the one that most benefits society.
And this, of course, I'm right that you share this, but in your daily life, perhaps you forget to introduce it into your speeches because you think that just by showing that this is the more efficient formula, the one that benefits users the most, etc., it should be enough. But that's not the case. Not even our customers, our clients, when they can choose, they're looking for the formula that provides them with the highest return. So in my view, building this type of organizations is based on building social legitimation, which is based in alliances with actors that have not been traditionally considered or that we've that we have ignored. and I'm sorry for being so harsh. It's bottom up. We have to work with the basis because there are many things to be done. And my experience this past year, I've taken part in experiences linked to this type of work is more complicated. It's more complicated to reach society than the elites because there are more people, more diverse, more complex. This is a highly complex technical matter. But what does society look for when they speak with us? They seek clear information without contradictions. People don't want a lack of information. They're constantly looking for information. And when we are silent, we don't give explanations because we think that we give explanations is going to be worse. I think we're all tempted to do this when we're speaking about complex things. We think, okay, they're not going to understand it. It's worse if I try to explain. So we generate a void in which our brain is trying to fill in the gaps, the story that we didn't tell. So then conspiracy theories start to come up, and we have a main role there. There are inventions, faked things that are trying to fill in those gaps. To be reliable, it's not enough to communicate in a clear way. We need to act in a clear way. We need to make decisions, act in a clear way that proves that our narrative is a reality, it strengthens our role in society. And as I was saying, providing information. Communication and management are combined together. We need both of them to be efficient. First of all, we cannot hide. Second, we have to do things beforehand, before things happen. I think communication can never be based on reactions, in seeing where the attacks come from and then respond to them. Because communication time is very quick today, because just because it's a reaction, you're already late. You need to understand where problems are going to be, and you need to tackle them before they appear. And this has to do with another big issue we have, which is lack of information. You have to fight this lack of information beforehand, knowing where the sources are. Exercise and leadership. Looking for flags that affect our core business with a social component. Close flags, things that are close to us, maybe intergenerational. They have an impact on our core business, but they have a clear social purpose. They're linked to the common good. Thinking in the long and mid and long term and giving hopes without being childish. It looks like, since we're not really credible, we're trying to explain our issues. It's like we are asking people to have faith, but without reasons. We need to treat customers like mature people. We have to appeal to their individual responsibility without forgetting about social responsibility and involving citizens by setting an example. We have to try to create social culture. This is the big challenge. The big challenge is not tackling different crises at different points in time, but trying to influence the social culture so that we act in a natural way. From an information perspective, we have a series of problems right now where users want things immediately. They want everything and they want it now. There's no future perspective. When there's no explanation and no information, conspiracy theories come up. And in this context, which is prone to misinformation, to fake news, and very often our organizations are victim of those. And it's in that context in which we have to consider our communication, which has to be based on emotion, logic, and reason. And I'll finish in very quickly with these three axes to build our responses. First of all, social one. We need to be familiar with the drivers on which we're going to build our positioning. We should stop being perceived as organizations that deprive societies of their income or this possibility of having some capital available at some particular point in time. Very often, we are the first ones to believe the conspiracy theories, in this case, against ourselves. We don't think that there are people in society that could spontaneously have a negative view of us. But the reality is that the waves that have been built in public opinion, they were initially targeted at us. But after that, they ended up permeating society because they've used mechanisms, language, narratives that had a good social response and they were credible. So, in my opinion, we cannot say, well, this is not true, so we need to keep on insisting. We need to respond to those attacks because even if they're false, if they permeate society, at some point, there's not a hand moving them around. We have to be aware of our limitations, our mistakes, because it's the only way to respond to some elements that trigger those attacks. When an attack campaign is built, they're often built in small realities taken out of context. They're not based on lies. So once we realize that when we realize that the attack campaigns are based on realities out of context, we can afford to face that reality. I'll, I'll give you a recent example. In one of the countries in which we work, the customers of one company, when they died, relatives did not receive any information on the type of services they were entitled to based on their contribution. The law allowed that, and none of the 7 or 8 companies that worked in that country were trying to give an answer to families in a situation in which they were not receiving information. They didn't know in which company the dead individual had been contributing. This is a minor problem, but the social repercussion was huge because when it was known, it has all the ingredients to build a negative information that affects us. It had the seed of destruction, so to speak, the destruction of the reputation of this type of companies. So identifying injustices and responding to them and sorting them out is more efficient than looking for short-term solutions. The messages against criticism have to work around these ideas. It's partial and exclusive. They would create a financial storm. This is just a few examples to give you an idea. We have to differentiate between the model and the practice. Perhaps the model is perfect, but when taken to practice, it's flawed. The messages related to the social network have an effect on media and in politics. In the media, well, it's not true. And from a political perspective, even if we want to disguise it, politics go after social issues, more particularly the cases in which these waves become unstoppable. Political instability favors this type of attacks. We need to prepare answers and responses that are related to professionalization and creating management models to ensure a stable future beyond political changes, among other things. Therefore, we need to understand that communicate entails understanding social dynamics and adapting to them. In order to be heard, to be listened to, and reach our goals, our starting point should be society, not where we are or where we would like to be. We need to be where society is in order to transform the idea, the culture societies have about us. This is usually a complex and technical topic. And from that perspective, we will be able to change public opinion and culture. Assuming that the social scenario has changed radically, and even though I sounded negative in this presentation, a window of opportunity opens up for us here if we're able to understand the new logics of communication. I apologize for speaking longer than I should have, and thank you very much.